Every empire has its currency. In Rome, it wasn't gold, it was dignity. On the Palatine Hill, the emperor set its price, one bodice at a time. Inside the palace that ruled the world, senators' wives were lined up, priced, and sold under torchlight, not by thieves, but by decree. Every coin paid became state income, every touch an entry in the imperial ledger. So who paid for Rome's glory, and with what? The chronicles fall silent, but the ledgers, the bones, and the laws still speak. If you value the record, subscribe, because when the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Rome, 37 CE. The city that had conquered the known world was now ruled by a man barely 25, Gaius Julius Caesar Caligula. At first, he was adored, the son of Germanicus, heir to Rome's most admired general, a promise of renewal after years of Tiberian secrecy. Crowds celebrated his accession. Statues rose overnight. For a brief season, Rome believed itself reborn. Then came the decree that turned devotion into disbelief. One wing of the Palatine Palace, the Sacred Heart of imperial government, was to be remade into a house of pleasure. The rumor spread through the forum like smoke. Marble rooms once used for councils of state were draped in silk and scented oil. Courtiers whispered that the emperor had ordered couches arranged, prices set, and scribes appointed to record every payment. According to Suetonius and Cassius Dio, messengers were sent into the streets to summon men of every rank, citizen, freedman, even slave, to take part in what Caligula called the pleasures of the state. It sounded absurd, but it was law. The women who would serve were not courtesans. They were the wives and daughters of senators, summoned by imperial command. The men who had once debated legislation now saw their households conscripted into spectacle. Inside the palace, order prevailed with chilling precision. One clerk recorded names, another tallied coins. Guards maintained discipline. Each act was entered into the treasury accounts as public revenue. Desire had become administration. Contemporaries insisted the emperor did it for money, that Rome's finances were failing. But the claim collapses under arithmetic. Caligula controlled the empire's mines, ports, and provincial taxes. Whatever these rooms produced was trivial. The motive, historians now suggest, was not financial, but symbolic. In Rome, wealth could be lost and regained, but dignitas, a man's moral standing, was everything. To corrupt that dignity was to erase his political life. By turning noble women into instruments of the state, Caligula struck at the core of senatorial identity. Their wives' chastity had once embodied virtue. Now it testified to subservience. Witnesses said he moved through those rooms, not as participant, but as inspector. He paused beside the couches, spoke softly to the trembling guests, adjusted prices like an accountant balancing accounts of shame. To the senators, it was humiliation without language. To Caligula, it was procedure. Some accounts describe a bronze scale placed at the entrance so that visitors weighed their coins before entering, a ritual of measurement, as if desire itself were subject to audit. Each coin that fell was both payment and confession. The historian Dio called it a punishment disguised as pleasure. It was vengeance through formality, a theatre of obedience staged in the language of commerce. The innovation was not the sin, but its legality. Every humiliation was recorded, every witness bound by the weight of paperwork. Lust had been written into law. To the Senate, it was madness. To the emperor, equilibrium. He had inherited a class of men who imagined themselves the guardians of Rome's morality. Through one decree, he taught them that power lay not in lineage or virtue, but in the authority to define morality itself. The spectacle horrified even a culture accustomed to violence. Yet, beneath its obscenity lay a familiar pattern, the same logic that built amphitheaters and paraded captives through the streets. Rome had always turned suffering into ceremony. Caligula merely changed the stage. Where his ancestors offered gladiators to the crowd, he offered the Senate to its own reflection. What began as rumor became routine. Each night, the lamps burned. Each morning, the scribes closed their books and carried them to the treasury. In the silence between those transactions, Rome learned a quiet truth about itself, that governance and degradation could share the same handwriting. So the question endures. One history has never settled. Was Caligula's brothel madness, or method, a ruler's experiment in control disguised as vice? Because if humiliation can be taxed, obedience can be counted. And when obedience can be counted, freedom becomes nothing more than a figure in a ledger. When Rome called him insane, it was less a diagnosis than a defense. Because what Caligula built next was not chaos, it was a system, deliberate, procedural, and self-sustaining. After the brothel came the banquets. Senators were invited to dine with the emperor, their wives seated beside him according to whim. The evenings began with charm, wine, music, polished courtesy. Then, without warning, Caligula would rise, take a senator's wife by the hand, and disappear into an adjoining room. Moments later, he returned alone, poured himself wine, and described what had just occurred in front of her husband. No blood, no decree, only silence. The humiliation became part of the ritual. Suetonius records these scenes not as madness, but as custom. Each performance reinforced hierarchy. A husband's silence meant loyalty. Protest meant death. Caligula had discovered a new instrument of rule, shame without resistance. To modernize, it seems pathological. To Rome, it resembled law. The patria potestas, a father's authority over his household, was the core of Roman morality. By violating that sanctity in public, Caligula inverted power itself. The Senate had once ruled the empire through law. Now the emperor ruled the Senate through its violation. Each humiliation had paperwork. Lists of guests, fines, and gifts were kept. Slaves noted every expense, every gesture. The bureaucracy of intimacy grew until it resembled an office. Caligula wasn't dismantling Rome's machinery. He was reprogramming it. Procedure became performance. Then came the decrees. Treason laws, dormant since Tiberius, were revived. But Caligula changed their form. The accused read their own charges aloud, then praised his wisdom before sentencing. Some were spared, others executed. The uncertainty was intentional. Predictable fear breeds resistance. Arbitrary mercy breeds obedience. Under Caligula, even survival was theatre. A senator who laughed too early risked impiety. One who didn't laugh risked treason. The moral code that once defined the Republic now depended on the emperor's expression. Here his logic became clear, the fusion of law and spectacle. He didn't abolish process, he perfected it. Every trial, feast, and rumor followed the same choreography: accusation, display, absolution. Governance became ceremony. When he declared his sister Drusilla a goddess, the Senate was forced to formalize it. Priests were appointed, temples ordered, coins struck. What the public called blasphemy, the bureaucracy treated as paperwork. Caligula's grief became theology. By decree, he fused religion and power so tightly that questioning one meant defying both. Rome had no precedent. Earlier emperors sought divine approval. Caligula issued divinity. By elevating Drusilla, he announced that godhood was no longer celestial, but administrative. Worship became obedience. Cassius Dio later recognized the method behind the scandal. He made the sacred his property, Dio wrote, and compelled reverence through procedure. It was not faith, it was logistics. Temples became offices of allegiance. Every prayer to Drusilla was, in effect, an oath to the emperor. Even absurdity found purpose. When Caligula promised to make his horse, Incitatus, a consul, the Senate gasped. Yet, he wasn't joking. He was measuring submission. A horse in the chamber proved that the title of consul meant nothing without imperial consent. Governance became parody, obedience, confession. Senators debated the horse's qualifications in earnest, terrified that laughter might be treason. The chamber that once legislated law now performed it. What philosophers later called madness was, in structure, an experiment in hierarchy. Caligula's rule was not upheld by armies, but by spectators. He understood that power survives through performance, and every performance needs an audience that knows when to applaud. His cruelty endured because it was public, codified, and constant. Private vice would have faded into rumor. Ritualized humiliation became governance. By 39 CE, the system was complete. The treason courts overflowed. Most defendants were accused of failing to honor the emperor's divinity. Each verdict followed the same rhythm: confession, flattery, punishment, applause. Executions alternated with pardons, so that no one could predict which act might save them. Rome's moral language, honor, virtue, piety, dissolved into stage cues. Behind the spectacle, the empire still functioned. Taxes were collected, armies supplied, roads maintained. But its true foundation had changed. It was no longer built on law, but on psychological economy, the management of fear and pride. Safety depended on the ability to perform belief. Inscriptions from distant provinces confirm how far this spread. They invoke Gaius and the divine Drusilla as a single power, ruler and goddess fused. Cities competed to build temples in their honor. What began as palace ritual had become imperial policy. For the elite, the effect was corrosive. They could neither rebel nor feign ignorance. To resist was suicide. To obey was complicity. The Senate that once governed the world now governed its own silence. In Caligula's design, every emotion was calculated: loyalty, fear, even disgust. Each was a resource to be managed. He had found the formula every tyranny seeks, but few perfect. A government sustained not by faith, but by exhaustion. Yet, the mechanism contained its own decay. The emperor who demanded applause began to hear whispers. The rituals persisted, but reverence curdled into dread. The more completely he controlled obedience, the more fragile it became. So the pattern tightened. Decree by decree, law became theater. Theater became religion. Religion became surveillance. And beneath it all, The city that once worshipped reason now applauded madness, because it had learned that silence was survival. The question left hanging in every hall was not how long it could last, but what becomes of a world when fear itself becomes faith. By 40 CE, Caligula's empire was complete and exhausted. Every gesture carried consequence. Applause proved loyalty. Silence suggested treason. The emperor no longer ruled through armies or law, but through interpretation. Each movement, glance, or pause could decide a man's fate. Rome itself had become a stage, and its people actors reading from an invisible script. Yet fear has no loyalty. It obeys only until it finds release. Caligula's greatest illusion was control, the belief that terror could sustain reverence. But terror, like ceremony, needs renewal. Once fear becomes routine, it loses its edge. The emperor who once commanded awe began to command only exhaustion. The first cracks appeared within his own guard. The Praetorians, once flattered by his attention, now flinched at his gaze. Their devotion had become performance, and performance breeds fatigue. When he announced plans to move the capital to Egypt, to live among the gods he claimed as kin, the Senate saw blasphemy. The soldiers saw abandonment. The empire's devotion was eroding from its center outward. In January 41 CE, the performance collapsed. After a day of games at the Palatine Theatre, Caligula walked a narrow corridor toward his chambers. The torches smoked in the cold air. His guards followed. Among them, Cassius Chaerea, an officer the emperor had mocked for his soft voice, forcing him to kiss his hand before the troops. The insult had never healed. When the signal came, it was not shouted. Chaerea stepped forward and struck. Others joined. 30 blows, each deliberate. The empire's most theatrical ruler died without an audience, his blood pooling on the marble floor that had once hosted his feasts. No one came to defend him. Courtiers scattered. Senators gathered that same night, trembling but eager to reclaim dignity. They debated whether to restore the Republic, pretending to have forgotten their own applause. By dawn, decrees of divinity were revoked. By noon, his statues lay shattered in the Forum. His wife and child were executed, his name condemned. Damnatio memoriae, erasure by decree. But erasure is never complete. Systems leave residue. What Caligula built could not be buried with him. Because Rome did not destroy his machinery, it absorbed it. The next emperor, Claudius, promised restoration yet ruled with the same instruments: bureaucracy, surveillance, ritualized fear. The treason courts continued. The language of divinity remained in law. Rome learned that humiliation could govern longer than faith, and far cheaper than violence. The Senate congratulated itself for ending tyranny while preserving its paperwork. The empire, relieved but unrepentant, moved on, pretending the nightmare had been a man, not a method. Archaeology suggests otherwise. Inscriptions from the provinces still invoke Gaius and the divine Drusilla. Offerings continued for years after his death. The cult endured not from belief, but habit, the reflex of obedience that outlives its master. His experiment had succeeded too well. Obedience had become self-sustaining. Later historians called him mad. Madness isolates guilt. It comforts the reader. But Caligula's rule revealed something colder. That power, once procedural, no longer needs cruelty to remain cruel. It only needs participants. He understood what most rulers never dare admit, that obedience costs less than violence, and spectacle rules longer than law. When his performance ended, Rome simply replaced the actor. The costumes changed, the choreography remained. Today, the ruins of his palace yield ledgers, contracts, and tax fragments. But nothing of the brothel, the banquets, or the screams. The marble remembers only administration. Perhaps that is empire's final genius, to turn atrocity into paperwork, to disguise fear as order. Caligula's story ends where every tyranny begins, not in blood, but in routine. When control becomes ritual, order becomes worship, and worship becomes law. The instruments of obedience he forged did not die with him. They became Rome's immune system, protecting the structure that once destroyed him. And centuries later, when the empire itself crumbled, his question still lingered in its dust. Did Rome destroy its monster, or simply learn to live as his reflection? Because long after his body decayed, his logic endured, the logic that fear, once ritualized, needs no tyrant to survive. It only needs silence.